So to recap, I introduced Death Mother as the feelings and behaviour of a woman that threaten the life of her child. And in the first part, I explained how in the West, any woman who feels or behaves in that way is deemed to be behaving unnaturally, to be going against biology and against nature. In the last part, I introduced the idea that actually that's not correct, that women have evolved an emotional system which can feel a range of responses and feelings about their child, from complete commitment to hostility, and that all of that is natural, and that it's different places on that range, on that continuum, come alive depending on what a woman's environment is. The mechanism are often unconscious, but when there's a lot of food and a great deal of support, a woman is much more predisposed to be committed and loving to her child. In very tough times, when there's food shortages, where she doesn't have support, she's going to be much more at the hostile, ambivalent end of that continuum. In this part, I'm going to look at how a child's characteristics affect a mother's feelings and behaviours towards that child. We all know that the sex of an infant, the sex of a child, can make an enormous difference to how mother and father feels about the child. You know, we often hear about how boys are favoured, the one-child policy in China where so many girls were being aborted. In some societies, girls are favoured, but generally we hear about girls not being wanted and hostility towards girls. There's an article that I wrote that this talk has come out of, and I elaborate on that in the article. I'm not going to go into it here. A child's temperament can also make a difference. A child that's very passive and quiet is probably not going to elicit a lot of care from a parent. A child that's very difficult, that seems to be very demanding, that's very hard to soothe, might well elicit hostility. But what I'm actually going to focus on here more is on the robustness and the health of the child, because that certainly evolutionarily has been profoundly important to how a mother's feelings and behaviour have unfolded. Remember that throughout most of evolutionary history, between 30 and 50% of human children did not survive. And when death rates are that high, it made very little sense for women to commit to children who were unlikely to make it, children who weren't robust, children in poor health. And for our ancestors, and indeed for many women living in harsh environments today, premature, ill, disabled, sickly, weak children were killed, or they were more often just left to die of neglect. The first and most layered and intricate study of this is by a social anthropologist called Nancy Sieff, who worked with women living in shanty towns in Brazil. And she brings together many layers of history, of poverty, of politics, of economics to weave this very intricate and complex system. But the bottom line is that for these women, weak and ill infants were often left to die of neglect. The women did not see themselves as killing their infants. They'd say, well, this child never never took the bottle. This child doesn't like eating. This infant doesn't want to grab hold of life. But effectively, they weren't given milk, they weren't given water. And so they died of what Sieff calls passive infanticide, through neglect. And she argues that the image of the all-nurturing mother, the all-giving mother, is a modern artefact. It's a Western artefact, and it really can only exist in societies and cultures where women can trust that practically all their children are going to survive. In harsher environments where there were high child death rates, women just didn't have that emotional luxury. Cultural, social environment just didn't allow that. Aaron Denham did a study, another social anthropologist, did a study more recently in the Nankani in northern Ghana. And again, there are a medley of factors that lead to child death, including disease and poverty, political, religious systems, healthcare availability. But some disabled and ailing children are deemed to be spirit children, and they're poisoned. These children aren't seen as being possessed as spirits. They're seen as spirits who have taken on a human form and infiltrated a human family, a bit like a cuckoo, with the aim of causing mischief and harm. Among the Nankani, fathers have a big role in the decisions. Deciding whether a child is a spirit child or not involves going to diviners, and fathers are crucial in that whole process. But the diviners and then the concoction men who do poison children who are deemed to be spirit children are actually seen as people who save life, not as killers, because they're getting rid of the spirits. They're not killing a human. And Denham argues that actually there's a truth to that, because in this environment where diseases and poverty are so high, if you try to keep these sickly, weak children alive, they take so much care and so much resources that other children would be at risk. There wouldn't be enough to go around to other children, and so you'd get the death of other children. In Mali, in West Africa again, children who are developmentally delayed are again seen as spirit children, and this time, rather than being poisoned, they're just left out in the bush. And the belief is that they turn into snakes, snakes are believed to be spirits in some form. They turn back into snakes. And people have said, sometimes when I see a snake, I wonder if this used to be my child. Now, this sounds really far-fetched to us, but actually in Britain, Ireland, France, Germany, Sweden, most of Europe, between 1300s and 1800s, we had an almost identical belief, and that was the belief in changelings. So the idea was that fairies and elves and goblins, our form of spirits, if you like, would from time to time come and kidnap a newborn human baby, and they would put one of their children in its place. Often the children who were deemed to be changelings were children who were ill, who were developmentally delayed, who were physically disabled. Sometimes once a child got polio, it was deemed to be a changeling. And the behaviour around changelings was the same as the behaviour in West Africa. The kids were taken out into the forest, into, cold northern forests, for the spirit to reclaim them. This was an elf child. They were left out for the elves and the fairies and the goblins to reclaim. This is a 1907 image, a watercolour, of Cupid leading a child with polio out into the forests. What's its relevance today? Well, we do see its shadow, very sadly. So children with congenital abnormalities are 2 to 4 times more likely to end up in hospital from parental abuse than children that don't have those issues. Only last week I heard a radio programme about how they're going to have to create a whole legal system around surrogacy, because there have now been some cases where a couple have asked a woman to carry a child for them, and then the child that this woman has had some kind of abnormality, some kind of disability, and the couple who originally wanted the child saying, "We're not going to take it now, we don't want this child." And the woman never thought she was going to raise a child. She was, doing them a favour, carrying a child for them. And so it's becoming an issue that people are saying we're going to have to address now. Janet Mann is a psychologist who did a preliminary study in the 90s with twins, looking at preterm twins. And she looked at when these twins came home, they had been in incubators and hospital for a long time, but when they finally came home, how mums responded to them. And what she found was that she looked at 7 pairs of twins, and what she found was that every one of those mothers, all 7 mothers, paid more attention to the healthier twin, although they absolutely swore that they weren't. They swore that they were treating both twins equally. And they genuinely believed that. They weren't They were unaware that they were paying more attention to the healthier twin, but something in them unconsciously was giving more care to the child that seemed more robust, more healthy, more likely to make it. So to sum up the evolutionary and the anthropological section, the belief that biology programs mothers for unconditional love is a fantasy. Throughout most of human history, death mother has been part of life. Ancestral mothers have raised children in a range of circumstances, and we've evolved a range of emotions to cope with that, to match that. And infanticide, death mother, is at one end of that range. Death mother can be thought of as a medley of conscious and unconscious feelings and behaviour that wax and wane depending on the circumstances. So a woman can lovingly nurture a strong and healthy child, and that same woman can fatally neglect one who's weak or ill. A mother can be fiercely committed to an infant who's born after a sibling's been weaned, but she can neglect or kill or just not pick up one whose birth is going to jeopardise the life of a still nursing toddler. In good times, when a woman's got plentiful food, lots of support, death mother has little place in women's lives. However, when the times are tough, death mother is going to emerge to colour an emotional palette. It's genuinely hard for us to take this on board. That's partly because of our fear of it. We don't want to face it. It's also partly because we live in unprecedented times. We have birth control. We can decide on the spacing of our children. Most of us have plentiful food. We all have relatively clean water. We have antibiotics. We have vaccinations. We have other forms of medical care. Mercifully, few of us have experienced the death of the child. It was different for our ancestors. Child death was not out of the ordinary. Nearly every parent will have lost at least one child, and often more. And practically every child, when growing up, will have experienced the death of a sibling, of a cousin, or one of its friends. In my 20s, I did anthropological research in Tanzania. And one of the things that I did was I looked at the number of children that women have had and did kind of their life histories, recorded it as part of the research that I was doing. And I've sat with women who've they were very traditional living people in a wilderness area of Tanzania. And I've sat with women who have had 12 live births and who don't have a single surviving child. You know, when you've got 50% of your children dying before they're 15, that's going to leave some women with no surviving children at all. And that has been how it's been for most of human history. The state we have now is very new and very unusual. For most of the time that humans have existed, the death of a child from one cause or another has been part of life. And that painful reality lives on in us. It lives on in our body and psyche, even if it's not today's reality. But it was there for so much of our existence. It's woven into the fabric of who we are. The fact that maternal ambivalence and hostility has been part of our evolutionary history doesn't mean it's desirable or that we're destined to live it. Because something was this way in the past doesn't mean it should be this way in the present. That's called the naturalistic fallacy, when you say, well, this is how it was in the past, this is how it was throughout human evolution, this is what we should do now. We need to have discretion when looking at the past, when looking at our evolution and seeing whether aspects of it would make a difference to today's well-being. So certainly adapting some aspects of how life was in the past would make a difference. Less sugar, more exercise, probably carrying babies skin to skin. Breastfeeding we know makes some difference. For women, having a lot of support around them. There are many things that could enhance the present, but there's aspects of the past that are not going to. I mean, nobody in their right mind would suggest that we should go back to a natural time, when child mortality rates were between 30 and 50%. But To bring child mortality rates down from that, we had to understand diseases, we had to understand hygiene, we had to get beneath what was causing all that in order to make a difference to that. And it seems to me that understanding a mother's ambivalence and understanding what underlies infanticide can also help us to best work with it, to change it so that it's not being expressed and lived in the present time. So in the final part, I'm going to explore and expand on how this understanding, how an evolutionary and anthropological consciousness can help both women and indeed men who are living aspects of the death mother energy and those who grew up with a death mother of some kind. How can evolutionary and anthropological understanding contribute to healing, to change, and to well-being?